I know this isn't what anyone expects from a man like me. I've spent a lifetime standing in front of cameras, firing fake guns, delivering tough lines, then going home to my own silence. I am not a preacher. I am not a theologian. I am just an old man who has seen too much to believe in fairy tales. And yet that night, everything I thought I understood about this world shattered. It was just another quiet night in my house. I wasn't reading the Bible to look holy. I was reading it because my heart had grown heavier with age. Somewhere between the pages in the darkness, I drifted off. And in that strange space between sleep and waking, I saw him, Jesus, not the painting in a church hallway, a presence so real it silenced every breath in my body. He looked at me, into me, and spoke with a calm that was almost frightening. He said he would show me the truth about black people, a truth I had spent a lifetime refusing to see. And what he revealed to me that night brought my soul to its knees. I didn't fall into that dream all at once. It felt more like slipping under the surface of a quiet lake. One moment I was in my old armchair, the TV off, the house wrapped in the kind of silence that only visits you when you've outlived most of your noise. The next moment, the room around me began to thin out, like smoke losing its shape, and it had been a long day, though I hadn't done much that would look important on paper. At my age, exhaustion isn't about what you did. It's about what you've been carrying for too many years without putting it down. Regrets, faces, headlines, things you wish you'd said, things you wish you hadn't. I remember closing the Bible on my lap and letting my eyes rest. I told myself I was just going to sit for a minute. Somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, the world changed. The first thing I noticed was the sound, or rather, the lack of it. No hum from the refrigerator in the kitchen. No passing car outside. No old clock ticking in the hallway. It was as if someone had taken all the background noise of my life and turned the volume all the way down. That kind of silence doesn't feel peaceful. It feels surgical, precise, like something is about to be cut open. Then came the light. Not a flash, not lightning, not the warm yellow of a lamp. It was a pale, steady glow, seeping in from somewhere I couldn't locate. It didn't hurt my eyes, but it made everything else look unreal, like my living room was suddenly a set built to resemble itself. The edges of the furniture softened. Shadows lost their weight. I looked down at my hands, and for a second, I wasn't sure if they were really there. You know that feeling when an elevator starts to move and your stomach doesn't catch up right away? That's what it felt like inside my chest. My body was still in the chair, but something in me was being pulled forward, as if the air in front of me had quietly opened and decided to draw me in. I wasn't walking. I wasn't standing up. I was just moving. I tried to speak, to say something ordinary, something to break whatever spell ID stepped into. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. The air tasted different too, not like my house, not like dust or old wood. It was clean, almost sharp, like the air on a winter morning before the world has had time to dirty it. Then the room was gone. I found myself standing, though I couldn't swear I had legs to stand on, in a space that didn't belong to Earth. There were no walls, no ceiling, no floor I could name. Just that same pale light stretching out in every direction. As if I were standing in the middle of a thought God hadn't finished yet. I should have been terrified. Maybe I was. But under the fear was something else, something I hadn't felt in a long time. The cold certainty that I was no longer in control of what happened next. That was the moment I understood. I had crossed a line, stepped out of the ordinary world and into a place where excuses don't work, where the truth doesn't need your permission to show itself. And, whether I liked it or not, I was already inside. He didn't arrive with thunder. There were no trumpets, no choirs, no angels crowding the sky. One moment, I was standing in that endless pale light, feeling like a man who'd stepped out of his own life by mistake. The next moment, I realized I was no longer alone. I didn't see him walk toward me. It was more like I became aware of a presence, and then my eyes caught up with what my soul already knew was there. He stood a few steps ahead, facing me, as if he had been waiting long before I showed up. Jesus, I've seen a lot of paintings of him in my time. Churches, hotel rooms, movie sets, they always get pieces of him, right? The robe, the hair, the soft expression. But this wasn't a painting. This wasn't something you hang on a wall and forget about. This was a weight in the air, a center of gravity so strong it felt like everything else in that place existed only because he allowed it. His face wasn't glowing. There was no halo. If you tried to describe him, you could say he looked like a man in his 30s, weathered by sun and road and too many conversations with people who didn't want to listen. His eyes, though that's where everything broke down, they were not the eyes of a character. They were not performing. They were steady, alive, impossibly calm. And there was a depth in them that made me feel like he'd spent my whole life skimming the surface of things. He looked at me, and I had the uncomfortable feeling of being read, line by line. "Clint," he said, "just my name, no title, no introduction." The voice was not loud, but it carried the way a gunshot does in an empty canyon. It didn't echo. It settled, low, steady, with a kind of weariness that wasn't tiredness, but something else like he'd been through more than any man could survive and was still standing. I tried to answer, but the words tangled in my throat. What do you say to the one person who has heard every thought you've ever had, especially the ones you'd never dare to speak out loud? You've spent a lot of years telling other people's stories, he went on. Heroes, villains, men searching for justice, men running from guilt. It sounded less like an accusation and more like a simple inventory of my life. I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with fame. My movies, my interviews, my carefully built image, none of it mattered here. In front of him, I wasn't Clint Eastwood, the legend. I was just a man with a long record and no lawyer. "You've seen war," he said. "You've seen hate. You've seen what people can do to each other when they refuse to see the soul in front of them." Images flickered at the edges of that strange light. Newsreels, headlines, faces on television, protests, burning cities, bodies on the ground. Things ID watched from a distance, things ID talked about over dinner, things ID turned off when they became too loud. Something in my chest clenched. "I am not a pastor," I managed to say. "I don't know what I am supposed to do with all of this." He took a step closer. The space between us shrank, but the distance I felt inside myself widened. I realized how small my understanding of the world really was. "I didn't bring you here to preach," he replied. "I brought you here to see." "See what?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would cost me something. He held my gaze, and for a moment his eyes grew impossibly sad, like he was carrying a grief that didn't belong to him but to the people who had ignored it. "The ones you've overlooked," he said softly. "The ones the world still refuses to understand. I am going to show you the truth about my black children." The light around us shifted, darkening at the edges. I felt the ground, or whatever passed for ground in that place, tilt beneath me. "And when you see it," he added, "you won't be able to pretend you didn't." The light around us dimmed, but it didn't go dark. It changed, like a curtain being drawn over a stage so the next scene could begin. I felt the air thicken, and then without moving I was standing somewhere else. We were in a street I didn't recognize, yet somehow I'd seen it 1,000 times before. Cracked sidewalks, old brick buildings, a siren in the distance that never quite arrived. The sky was the color of dirty glass. People were walking past me, but no one could see me. They moved fast, shoulders tight, eyes scanning for trouble they already expected to find. "These are my children," Jesus said beside me. His voice didn't echo here. It just existed, woven into the air itself. I watched a black mother holding her son's hand a little too tight. Every time a police car rolled by, her fingers clenched harder, just for a second, the way a heart does when it skips a beat. The boy was talking about something simple, school, a game, a joke, but her eyes weren't on his words. They were on the world around him, measuring danger, calculating exits. You see fear, Jesus said, but you don't see where it comes from. The scene shifted. Now we were in a small church, the kind built more on hope than money, wooden pews polished by years of hands and tears. A choir singing a hymn I half remembered from my childhood, but there was something in their voices. It never touched a kind of joy that had survived too much pain to be naive. On the back wall, photos of black men and women, old and young, some smiling, some serious. A few had dates under their names that ended too early. They praise me, he said, even when the world treats them like a problem to be solved instead of hearts to be known. I felt something in my throat tighten. I'd seen images like this on screens, documentaries, news segments, movies, but I always had the comfort of turning them off. Here, there was no remote control. You've heard the stories, Jesus continued. Chains, ships, auctions, laws written to keep them small, systems built to keep them tired. You've seen the footage, dogs, hoses, batons, knees, and his eyes met mine, and in them I saw something I wasn't ready for. Grief so old it had outlived generation after generation of the people who caused it. But you learned to look away, he said gently. You told yourself it was history. You told yourself it wasn't your fight. The world around us blurred, and then we were somewhere else again, a classroom this time. A young black girl sat at a desk, hand raised, eyes bright. She knew the answer. You could see it in the way she leaned forward, trying not to burst. The teacher hesitated, then called on someone else. A quieter child, a safer choice. The girl's hand dropped. So did her gaze. That's how it happens, Jesus said. Not just in headlines, in small ways. Every day, 1,000 cuts that never make the news. I wanted to argue, to say not everyone was like that, not all the time, but in that place, excuses sounded thin even before they were spoken. Look closer, he told me. I saw black fathers working 2 jobs and still being called lazy. Black mothers labeled angry for protecting their children the way anyone would. Black boys turning jokes into armor so the world wouldn't see how scared they were. Black girls shrinking their brilliance to make other people comfortable. They carry burdens that were never theirs to begin with, Jesus said. They bleed for sins they did not commit. The scenes came faster than a march, a courtroom, a hospital room, a traffic stop, faces changing, but the pattern staying the same. Hurt, resilience, suspicion, hope, all coiled together like barbed wire around a beating heart. If the world loses them, he whispered, it loses its courage, its music, its memory of me in the middle of suffering. Something inside me flinched at those words. I realized this wasn't just about them. It was about me, about what I had chosen not to see, not to say, not to stand beside. I thought I understood, I said quietly. I watched the news. I cared. I shook my head like everyone else. He didn't accuse. He didn't raise his voice. He just held my gaze. And in that silence I felt an entire life's worth of indifference, being weighed and found wanting. That's the problem, he replied. You thought feeling sorry was the same as seeing the truth. And with that, the scene stopped. The light held steady. And for the first time, I felt something inside me begin to crack. I wish I could tell you I handled it with dignity. Then I stood there in that strange light, nodded like a wise old man, and said something profound. I didn't. I broke. It didn't happen all at once. At first, it was just a tightness in my chest, the kind you get when you're trying not to cry in front of someone. I swallowed hard, forced my jaw to stay clenched. Men like me are trained in that, hold the line, don't flinch, don't let anything leak out. But whatever it used all my life to hold myself together, it wasn't built for this. Images kept replaying in front of me. Not the ones from the news anymore, those big, loud, obvious moments. No, What hurt the most were the quiet ones. The jokes ID laughed at and never challenged. The times I changed the channel because the story made me uncomfortable. The interviews where I could have said more but didn't. All the years I let myself believe that staying neutral made me civilized instead of cowardly. My breathing turned shallow. Each inhale felt like it had to fight its way in. Jesus hadn't moved. He didn't need to. The truth had shown me was doing all the work. I didn't know, I heard myself say. The words sounded small, even to me. I didn't see it like this. It was honest, but it wasn't enough, and I knew it. You can live a long time in this world with your eyes half closed and still call that seeing. You can watch a man bleed on a screen and by the time the commercial comes on, be thinking about what you're going to have for dinner. My knees gave out before I decided to kneel. 1 second I was standing, the next I was on the ground, hands pressed against whatever passed for floor in that place. It was solid, but it felt like kneeling on my own record, every moment of silence, every shrug, every that's just how things are. I should have done more, I whispered. I should have said more. I should have seen them. The words came tumbling out, clumsy and late. There's a particular shame that comes with realizing you weren't the villain, but you weren't the ally either. You were just there, watching, benefiting from a system you didn't build, but also didn't question hard enough. Memories pushed in, uninvited. Black actors ID worked with. Crew members whose names I barely remembered now, whose talent ID respected, but whose battles ID never asked about. Headlines ID skimmed. Stories ID considered political, just so I could file them away in a drawer labeled, "Not my problem." I felt old in a way ID never felt before. Not the kind of old that makes you move slower. The kind that makes you realize how many chances you've already spent. "I am sorry," I said, and this time the words tore something open inside me. "God, I am so sorry." Tears came, not the cinematic kind, just hot, clumsy, uncontrollable. They blurred my vision, but I didn't bother wiping them away. What was the point? There was no camera to protect my image here. No publicist to spin this into something noble. It was just me and the truth and the God who had dragged it out where I could finally see it. For a terrible moment, I was afraid he would agree with every accusation I was silently throwing at myself, that head list all the ways ID failed and stamped too late across my life. He didn't. I felt a hand on my shoulder, not heavy, not light, just there, steady, present, the kind of touch that says, "I know exactly who you are," and doesn't pull away. "You are seeing now," Jesus said quietly. "That's why it hurts." I kept my eyes on the ground. What good does it do to see this late? He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It held something I didn't recognize at first. Room for grief, room for regret, room for a man who'd spent his life pretending he already understood everything. "You can't change yesterday," he finally said, "but you can decide what kind of man wakes up tomorrow." His words didn't erase the guilt. They didn't wipe the slate clean. They did something harder. They left the weight where it was, but they refused to let it crush me into uselessness. I stayed there on my knees for what felt like a long time, long enough to realize that this wasn't punishment. It was surgery, painful, precise, and absolutely necessary. And somewhere in that breaking, I understood. This wasn't just about how the world had treated black people. It was about how I had let the world stay that way without paying the full price of my own comfort. I don't know how long I stayed on my knees. Time doesn't move the same way when your excuses have all been stripped away. At some point, the raw edge of my guilt stopped screaming and settled into a dull, steady ache like a wound that had finally been cleaned, even if it still stung. Jesus didn't rush me. He just stayed there, one hand on my shoulder, as if had held up a mirror and was giving me the decency of a moment to really look. "When you were a boy," he said softly, You learn to see the world in pieces. Us and them. Safe and dangerous. Familiar and foreign. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple fact, spoken by someone who had watched the whole thing happen. You were taught to respect strength, he went on, to admire toughness, to survive by staying out of trouble and out of certain conversations. He paused, letting that sink in. But strength, he said, is not turning away from another man's pain because it makes you uncomfortable. Strength is standing close enough to feel it. I lifted my head a little. His words didn't feel like spiritual poetry. They felt like instructions. You live in a world, he continued, that has spent centuries telling itself lies about black people to ease its own conscience. I saw flashes again, books, films, jokes, stereotypes, stories written to contain a group of people instead of understand them. It called them less, he said, then called them dangerous when they refused to stay less. His eyes were steady, searching mine. You cannot pretend you were separate from that, he added, but you also cannot stay frozen in your shame. That last part startled me. What am I supposed to do? I asked. I can't fix the past. I can't rewrite history. No, he agreed, but you can decide what story you tell from now on. There was a weight to the word story that I couldn't ignore. I spent my whole life dealing in stories, choosing which ones to tell, which faces to put on screen, which truths to tame so audiences wouldn't walk out. Listen to me, he said. The lesson is not that you are the hero. The lesson is that you were blind, and now you're not. He took a breath that seemed to move through the whole space we were in. Black people, he said, are not a problem for you to solve, or a subject for you to feel guilty about from a distance. They are my sons and daughters, bearers of my image, carriers of a strength this world forced them to grow. I thought of the mother on the street, the girl in the classroom, the choir in the church. They have laughed in deserts, he said, built homes in places that wanted to crush them, forgiven more than anyone had the right to ask of them. Their existence is not a lesson in suffering. It is a testimony of endurance. He stepped around me so that I was looking up at him directly. The question is not, how do you fix them? He said. The question is, how do you honor them? The simplicity of it hit harder than any sermon. Honor them by seeing, he continued, by listening, by refusing to repeat lazy lies when you know better, by using whatever influence you have to tell the truth instead of the comfortable version of it. His voice didn't rise, but every sentence felt like it carried a verdict and an invitation at the same time. Compassion, he said, is not a feeling. It is the courage to stay when the truth is heavy. It is choosing the hard, honest story over the easy, dishonest silence. I swallowed, and if I fail, I asked quietly, if I fall short again? You will, he answered, without hesitation. You're human, but now you will know you are falling, and you will know which way to turn to stand up again. Something eased in my chest, not relief, exactly, but a strange, sober hope. This wasn't about becoming some kind of saint. It was about refusing to be willfully blind ever again. Remember this, he said, and his voice gentled. When you look at my black children, you are looking at people I have walked beside through fire. Speak of them, think of them, act toward them as if that is true. He let the words hang there, because it is. I woke up before the sun did. For a few seconds, I didn't know where I was. The ceiling above me was the same one ID stared at for years. The weight of the blankets was familiar. The old ache in my back was still there. But something else had shifted, and it wasn't in the room. The house was quiet, the way it always is in those thin hours when the world hasn't decided what kind of day it's going to be yet. Normally, I would have rolled over, checked the clock, bargained with my bones for a little more sleep. Instead, I just lay there, staring at the faint line of light sneaking around the edges of the curtains. I remembered everything, the street, the church, the classroom, the faces, the hand on my shoulder, the way his voice had cut through my defenses without ever raising its volume. None of it faded like a normal dream. It sat in me, solid and immovable, like a stone dropped into a deep well. After a while, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and sat there, elbows on my knees, breathing. The floor was cold against my feet, but I barely felt it. What I felt more than anything was a kind of clarity I hadn't asked for but couldn't turn off. You can't go back to sleep after something like that. Not really. I walked through my house as the first light of morning began to seep in. The pictures on the walls looked different, not because they'd changed, but because I had photos from film sets, awards, old posters where my name took up more space than it probably deserved. ID spent decades telling stories about justice, courage, right and wrong. Now I had to live with the question of why it had taken a dream to make me really look at certain people the way I should have, all along. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window. Outside, the street was waking up. A jogger, a delivery truck, a neighbor walking their dog. Ordinary life, moving along without any idea what had happened in my head while they were asleep. Across the street, a car pulled into a driveway. A black family ID, seen 100 times but never really noticed, climbed out. Parents, 2 kids, backpacks, yawns, the small chaos of a weekday morning before the dream. I would have glanced at them and gone back to my own thoughts. Today, I stayed at the window. I watched the father lean down to say something to his son. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew that look equal parts love and warning. The kind of look you give when you know the world won't always be kind, and you're trying to prepare a child without breaking him. For the first time, I didn't just see neighbors. I saw people he had called his children, people who carried history in their bodies, in the way they moved through space that hadn't been built with them in mind. I felt a strange, quiet resolve settle in. I couldn't rewrite the roles ID chosen in the past. I couldn't go back and change the moments when ID shrugged off someone else's pain because it didn't touch my daily life. But I could choose what I did with whatever time I had left. I could listen differently, speak differently, refuse to laugh at things that weren't funny, even if it made the room awkward. Use whatever voice I still had, not to center myself in their story, but to honor the truth they'd finally seen. That morning, I didn't make any grand vows. I didn't script a speech. I just made a simple decision. I would not look away again. As the family crossed the front yard, the father glanced up and saw me at the window. Old habit would have made me nod once and turn away. Instead, I opened the door and stepped outside. "Morning," I called out. He hesitated, then nodded back. There was a question in his eyes, the kind you learn to carry when the world has given you too many reasons to be cautious. This time, I didn't rush past it. I let that look sit between us. I let it matter. "Have a good day," I added. And it wasn't small talk. It was a blessing, a quiet apology, and a promise I didn't fully know how to keep yet, but I intended to try. Because once you've seen the truth standing in front of you with scars in his hands and grief in his eyes, you don't get to go back to pretending you're just a spectator. Script is not finished yet. Next, I will move to part 3, moral closing, to 600 words, with 3 layers: reflection, universal message, and a final iconic line. I carried the dream with me for days, not as a memory, but as a weight, quiet, steady, unignorable. It settled behind everything I did. When I made coffee, when I answered the phone, when I walked past a mirror and caught my own reflection, staring back like a man I didn't recognize. The strangest part wasn't the vision itself. It was the silence that followed. The kind of silence you only hear after you've been told the truth and there's nothing left to hide behind. I could still feel his hand on my shoulder, steadying me when I broke open. I could still hear his voice telling me the one thing it'd never considered. not to fix, not to preach, not to pity, but to honor. Honor the stories I had overlooked. Honor the people I walked past without understanding what they carried. Honor the truth, even when it pressed hard against the version of myself I had grown comfortable with. There's a moment after any revelation, after the shock, after the guilt, when you're left with a simple question. Now what? The dream didn't give me a map. It didn't give me a script. It gave me something harder. It gave me responsibility. And as I moved through my ordinary days with this extraordinary truth burning slow inside me, I realized that transformation doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with small decisions, and quiet ones, the kind you make when no one is watching. We live in a world that teaches us to look quickly and assume we've seen enough. We like simple stories, clean categories, heroes here, villains there. But real life isn't built that way. People aren't built that way. Pain isn't evenly distributed, and opportunity doesn't fall from the sky the same way for everyone. Most of us don't wake up trying to be cruel. We wake up trying to survive. And sometimes, in our rush to protect our own comfort, we convince ourselves that someone else's struggle isn't ours to understand. We distance ourselves. We rationalize. We call it not getting involved. We call it keeping the peace. But the truth is far less flattering. We look away because looking closely costs us something. The dream showed me what happens when you stop looking away. You begin to see people as more than headlines, more than stereotypes, more than characters in a story you didn't bother to read past the first chapter. You see their resilience, their fear, their pride, their exhaustion, their joy, their history pressed into their bones. You see the unfair weight they carry and the astonishing grace with which they carry it. And maybe, for the first time, you understand that acknowledging someone's wounds doesn't threaten you. It humanizes you. Compassion doesn't weaken a man. It clarifies him. It tells him what side of history he's willing to stand on. In the end, the world doesn't change because we make speeches. It changes because we finally see each other clearly and act accordingly. I can't force anyone to believe what I saw. I wouldn't try. But if you've stayed with me this long, if you've listened to every moment, every crack in my voice, every truth I didn't want to face, then maybe this message wasn't meant for me alone. Maybe it found you for a reason. Maybe you're being asked to look a little closer, to listen a little deeper, to honor the stories you once walked past without a second thought. Because revelation isn't a flash of light. It's the quiet, unshakable realization that you can no longer pretend you don't know. And once you see the truth, even in a dream, you are responsible for what you do with it.